just going to preface this by saying I won't be comparing this to any other tactical RPGs. Though let's face it, comparisons are easy to make. I just don't want to say, oh, it's like that game, or alienate people who haven't played the old game in this niche genre. I'll let the games speak for themselves. It's especially easy to do that if these are viewed as products of their time, because the first game I'm covering, Crystal Warriors, was a Game Gear tactical RPG that predated the Game Gear release of Shining Force. Oh goddammit, I mentioned it. Okay, from here on out, I won't make comparisons. The Game Gear is often called a portable Master System, since the only games it had were just seemingly Master System conversions. But there were a small handful of games released on this that never got a home console release. And in this video I'll be looking at two of them, Crystal Warriors and Royal Stone. These are two such games that have never been given a spotlight outside of some kind of listicle and cult classics you've never heard of. It isn't helping that the first game here is very basic, and at the time of writing only saw a single re-release on the 3DS Virtual Console, which is now shutting down, with no further plans of Game Gear preservation being announced. And the second of these games didn't even get that. It was only re-released on one of those Game Gear Micro novelty toys, which are too small for serious play, and are exclusive to Japan. Yeah, these games have been dealt a bad hand. No wonder people don't know what I'm talking about when I mention this duology. These are internally developed Sega games. They probably just wanted their own slice of this genre, and I respect what they attempted here. The first game here in particular really feels like a first draft in comparison to its sequel. But to kids playing Game Gear in 1992, it wouldn't have looked like that. Sure, this is a pretty short game, but it's a replayable burst of enjoyment, complete with its own multiplayer mode for those of you that want to link up and fight head to head. But from the single player perspective, we start by getting some short exposition about the elemental crystals and how the villains are after them. It's very boilerplate, but more importantly, it's largely ignored, and it's only there to justify the gameplay itself. What's more important is that we play as Princess Iris, and she's the one leading the charge to get these crystals back and restore peace. She has no personality or real writing, she's really just a blank canvas, but I do like the choice to have the lead be a woman, and a lot of the party members follow suit. The cast, while having few words total, all look incredibly distinct and I love their designs. Though in terms of actual gameplay, they're a lot more samey than they initially appear. Excluding the princess, who is her own unique class, we have 5 character classes. 3 are basically physical attackers of different builds, and we have healers and magi for MP consumption of both the supportive and damage dealing varieties. The princess basically lies in the middle as an attacker who can do a little bit of healing on the side. She is your standard hero class protagonist. These are all made more varied though, with the 4 elements here that basically play rock, paper, scissors. Fire is strong against wind but weak to water. Water is strong against fire but weak to wind. And wind is strong against water but weak to fire. Then you have earth, who is its own 4th element and it's just doing its own thing. It's basically the normal type here and isn't affected by the other 3. The only earth types you lead are the priests, magi, and princess herself. Every non-magic party member, and a good majority of the enemies, fall into this elemental triangle. The problem is the way they're attributed. We have 3 ranger classes that are all wind. We have 4 fighter classes, 2 are water and 2 are fire. And we have 2 lord characters, one is fire and the other is water. It'd be nice to see more variety in these. Basically leaves all the rangers feeling largely the same, and half the fighters and lords are the same as well. This game does have permadeath, so you could see it as outright replacing the dead with a carbon copy, but that feels like it lowers the overall stakes of such a system. And if you're fortunate enough not to have characters die, you'll just be left with not recruiting someone because they're the same as what you already have. At least the characters are nice enough to color code themselves. All the fire guys dress in red, the water in blue, and the wind in purple. Or at least purple in their detailed portraits, because they also look blue when zoomed out on the map. Yeah, that's not confusing at all, is it? It almost ruins the point when I can't quickly tell if the enemy will be weak to my attack, or be actually very defensive against it, but able to 2-hit kill my character. At least there's a menu which lets you check an enemy's elemental alignment. This and many other issues are alleviated in the sequel, that allows you to give wind-based characters green sprites on the overworld. There is a way to bypass the unfair fights of rock, paper, scissors, and it's to basically cheat and probably violate the rules of war in this universe. There are monsters on the field, and they're basically weaker and more defenseless enemies that have free experience. But whenever you defeat one as any character class that isn't a priest or magi, you can tame said monster, and you can carry up to 4 per character at any one time. During battle sequences which last 2 turns for each side, and you primarily attack or run away, you can instead bring out a monster per turn to basically shield for damage for their human tamer, and also do their own attack. These monsters follow the same elemental types as any other character, so it's wise to make sure you're protected against the most deadly attacks with your army of disposable monsters. They all have fairly low health and they will fall quickly and once again permanently, but they can be the difference between life and death of the main party. They're basically just emergency lifesavers, or at best a smart tactical decision to deal more damage. Just don't get too attached to them. This kind of immediate switching to a monster can be especially important, because it's not uncommon to go into a battle and not know the enemy's elemental affliction. Every non-monster enemy starts each round as a mystery. All we get to see is their locations and their total number, but their class, elements, and so on are a complete mystery at first. All we have to judge them is this question mark looking Ransona. If you're not careful, you can pick the wrong fights, but thankfully some characters can scan enemies one by one to work out what they are in advance. It's a small mechanic, but it does wonders to add more strategy, and it gives us an element of risk taking. Sure, it's faster to go just in and fight immediately, but it's perhaps wiser to take an extra turn to suss out if that's the best decision. And let's face it, it's such a simple game that it needs these wins when it can get them. Because yes, this game has a lot of fantastic mechanics, including how between every mission we can explore a small copy-paste village and spend our very limited money. More on that in a second, but for every neat idea Crystal Warriors includes, things are tarnished to counteract it. I already mentioned the characters being so samey, complete with things like all 3 ranger characters being wind-based, but other things seep their way in, like how characters have different movement options. They can perhaps walk extra distances in shallow water, or sand, or through trees, all based on what type of character they are. But it doesn't matter because it almost never comes up, and levels love funneling you through a literal paved road. Or how we can fail missions if our base is left undefended, but it almost never happens because the AI barely move and never make trips to your side of a map. They just stay idle and move closer to you whenever you enter their territory. I didn't even know this was a mechanic until the last mission of the game on my first playthrough. If judged through a modern lens, these games fall apart. There are more complex options out there, even on portable systems. But look at this from the perspective of when it released and what system it was for. That's when this game goes from an okay novelty to a charming and replayable burst of joy. And I should know, though not literally, I wasn't born when it came out. When I played this game sitting at home with my whole gaming library at my ready, I found it kind of dull. But during the holidays, I had to ride a couple trains to see my family, and being stuck with just this one game and no other real distractions, it turned this into a game I was super invested in. It was a fun time waster. It's the same reason why Super Mario Land 1 was much more fun as a kid. Let's go back to what I said about towns. That is where the meat of a game is to me. You get very limited money, and you'll never be able to buy everything you'll need. You'll often disregard things you basically need because you're too poor in-game to afford it. These towns offer different armor, weapons, spells, and on occasion new party members who you must pay to hire, even though they give you a sub-story about how much they need this. Really, they just want your money and to deprive you of necessary equipment upgrades. We can't sell our old equipment either, we just get rid of it. But that also leads to this game's very strict economy. Towns are there to make you think about hard decisions, especially if you lose a party member. Not only do you have to spend money to replace them, but you need to outfit them too. Good luck doing all that on a proper hardcore run where you never reload to an earlier save. The game is easy, but a single mistake is all it takes to snowball into problems. At least the game is considerate enough to not let you buy duplicates. There is no group inventory system here, just character equipment, and if you attempt to buy the same item twice, or buy a worse item, the game straight up won't let you. So the option to sell is never really missed here. Your gang only carry what they need to and not a single thing extra. But also this game isn't considerate enough to tell you what spells do before you purchase them. So I hope you kept your manuals from the early 90s, or if you have this on 3DS, just use the electronic manual, which is a feature I always use and no one else does. I love you electronic manual writers. So the real game of this game, to me, is doing quick replays where I make different financial decisions each time. I know that doesn't sound exciting, but it does change the game fundamentally when you replay it with entirely different parties and with different equipment at any given time. Especially when you learn that priests at the maximum level become the strongest physical attackers. It just takes a lot of effort to get them there, because you have to be the one to kill to earn experience. None of that simply contributing to the battle stuff, no. You must end a life to get experience, so you really need to think about who does the final strike against an enemy. Other than simplicity, I'd say the only other real issue here is the maps are sometimes too big for what they ask you to do in single player. You and the enemy are in opposite corners of the map, and since they barely move, you'll have turns where all you do is slowly traverse these boring flat landscapes. At least they find good excuses like mountains or water to force you to break up your party into smaller teams. It's not that deep, but it does help prevent your strategy from just being a single wall of death. And if you only have a single healer and you're splitting it up, you could be screwed. But yeah, at the end of the day, this isn't a super fun game. But all its ideas are great ones. It just needs more care put into the systems and depth. A remake would be a great idea, but I'm not holding my breath. But a few years later, Sega took the great basis they had here and made one hell of a game out of it. 1995's Royal Stone is basically Crystal Warriors 2, and it did what it could to fix every loose end it really could, while still being confined to the Game Gear. And first and foremost, the graphical leap between these two games is massive. 1991 Game Gear versus 1995 Game Gear. What a difference 4 years made. But what's more impressive is we start the game with a story. And I don't just mean a text scroll, but like a surprisingly lengthy non-playable narrative section that just gives us the basics of who we are. We're no longer a princess, we're Eva, a disgraced former soldier for the Royal Army who has just been imprisoned for killing her entire squad, including her father who was a part of it. The exact details, including her innocence, aren't revealed until much later, with sepia flashback sequences, so all we're left with is hoping she's a good person, but we're really only shown the kingdom's perspective. She's despised and sent into exile. Though she is guided by an angel named Kokot, who isn't there to do any combat, but just there for support, and it's who we play as during town sections, which are thankfully much more varied and interesting. The towns don't look the same anymore, and they all provide NPCs who have flavor text that remind us of the events happening in the world. The first game attempted it on occasion, but the samey villagers often just provided basic tutorial information long after the point we would have naturally learnt it through play. Here, it's all the good bits. The shops reflect this added polish. We get a group inventory, and an option to sell items, and we can buy seemingly useless items that can actually class change certain classes to specific other ones. Some of these are simple direct upgrades, like what is fundamentally a better healer or magi, but this is also how we access other classes like Evoker, which is the one class that can tame monsters and do that whole switching them out thing. Yeah, this entire aspect of the game has been changed dramatically. Now most characters can't cheese combat the same way, and the ones who do class change from Magi, who are previously long-range magic missile snipers, so you could argue this is a more dangerous change since they're usually up close now. We get far fewer get-out-of-death free cards, but there are still options. During combat, each class can attack and run, but there's now another option exclusive to different classes. In some cases, it'll be things like magic, which is pretty expected, as its monster summoning for its one specific class, but we also have the option to block for our tanks, which is much more reliable than running. And our more offensive fighters have skill attacks, which are often super strong moves that also hurt themselves with recoil damage. And the enemies use these same tactics, which means you get to experience all the tragedy that entails. Also, while on combat, the first game had nice, standard battle screens. They did their job, but look at these new ones, they're beautiful, complete with both front and back sprites to every character, enemy or monster, since we could see them from either perspective, for example when one of our characters heals another one. It also goes to the effort to show what surface they're fighting on, like sand or water. And to top off the nice illustrations, the health is represented as an hourglass looking thing, which is very unconventional, but it's very effective in quickly explaining everything even at a small glance. Damage depletes the top half of it, and in turn that fills up the bottom half. Given the way battles are portrayed, with the important HUD basically being a border to the spectacle, such a weird health bar doesn't get in the way at all. They manage to get form and function to perfectly align. All these character portraits have also been significantly upgraded if it wasn't obvious enough. Look at them. Combat is further enhanced with classes and elemental combinations, not just being the same tired things from before. This mission statement is made immediately obvious when we start the game, and we have a party of 4, with our protagonist and 3 characters in the fighter class. Each one is a different element of that main trio. Before we learn how to summon multiple monsters, we get the option to recruit monsters in lieu of party members. They get full teammate rights, and they aren't just a meat shield. We can move them around, use their attacks, give them equipment, and some are even hired in taverns after talking to them and paying them the required fee. Not only did the games establish monster rights, but it changes formations and would make replaying the game a jam for that alone. Even if the previous restricted money system of before is gone here. Now it's easy to have more money than you ever need. You can upgrade everyone and hire every character who wants it. It's not the same kind of tactical risk-taking, but this is no doubt more welcoming. And with all this added depth, it doesn't need to rely on that older system of before. Speaking of depth, maps have them, sometimes literally, since we can have higher and lower terrain, which is an organic way to split up the party without just more mountains ruining everything. And the promise of before where certain characters can move freely through things like trees, water, or desert are finally realized. These maps use them a lot more, and we don't have to rely on paved roads anymore. And missions use the maps expertly. Sometimes the enemies come to you, which shouldn't be a surprise, but it is considering where we started off. And sometimes after clearing out what you expect to be the final soldier, some dialogue boxes come up, and then the map translates to its second phase, and we see more of the map just reveal itself. It was just off screen the whole time, and the map doubled in size. And the pointless guys that we have to slaughter have flavor text now. We get to see their own dialogue, and it helps keep every mission connected to the larger overall plot. Oh yeah, the plot is about the Royal Stone. There's some stones that when gathered unleash evil, same old same old. That's not important, but the smaller, more character-focused moments are what keeps me coming. Like Eva explaining to her friend what happened before the events of the game that led to her imprisonment, or how we have a recurring antagonist, Luminette, who wants Eva dead because of this misunderstanding. She wasn't just Eva's friend, but adopted sister, since Luminette's father took Eva in at a young age, and it's this nice father who the world is convinced she murdered in cold blood. It excels in the smaller, more down-to-earth stuff. But even the larger, less interesting picture is made more personal with seeing things like kingdoms set on fire, and we have to explore these in a similar way to how we traverse the regular, non-flaming towns. It means we get to see the disastrous effects and lives ruined from this war, instead of just being told about it. And it feels earned when some people begin trusting Eva, who was basically a known criminal who was exiled for treason and murder. One downside to this more deliberate pace is it does take longer to get to experience the mechanics and all the classes here. The first game basically gave you everything up front, whereas it'll take several missions before we get something as simple as elemental magic here. Something is lost, but it was a nice risk to take, and it resulted in two very different feeling games, even if mechanically on the surface they look near identical. It's all about the pacing, replayability, and the depth. That's not even as simple as it seems, since Royal Stone has so much more depth in combat, but Crystal Warriors destroys it in the economy and having to make tough decisions which will permanently alter the rest of your game. I love both games, though the sequel is the one I can easily see more people wanting to play. It is certainly the more refined and deep experience, but that first one has its hooks in me for very specific reasons as well. The Game Gear was lucky to have both these games, even if they have no real legacy nowadays, and no one other than me and some 40-year-olds have ever played them. Speaking of which, I'm jumping back to the Game Gear again next time for a video on Master of Darkness, or to use its American name, Vampire Master of Darkness. That's not really that different of a name, is it? This is another forgotten Game Gear classic, though it also being on the Master System has left it in slightly more people's eyes. This game is basically Castlevania, but I can act elitist by talking about it instead of a game you've actually heard of. So yeah, be prepared for me to try to avoid saying, it's like Castlevania, but every few sentences.